General Hospital spoilers tease that the quiet of Port Charles is a lie, that beneath its lamplight in familiar storefronts lives a tangle of truths people keep tucked away like secret letters, and that one of those letters, yellowed at the edges, folded with the care of someone who trusted themselves more than anyone else, was about to change everything. Dante Falconeri had never imagined his job would lead him back into the small, private worlds people thought they had buried. He thought of evidence rooms and chain of custody forms, of fingerprints and dashcam footage, of the kind of concrete proof that made the city hum with order. He had not expected to find a human ghost in an envelope. The night he found it, Port Charles rained in a slow, persistent way that made the streets gleam and the smell of wet pavement press against the police station windows like an accusation. Dante was supposed to be cataloging old case files tied to a series of anonymous threats against Scout Kane, a duty that felt distant and clinical until the drawer jammed and a loose stack of paperwork slid out, bringing with it the small, unremarkable envelope. Someone had written a name on the front in Sam McCall's handwriting, Sam. The script leaned slightly, as if hurried by someone who always moved faster than the world around her. Dante's fingers recognized the curl of the letters the way a musician recognizes a recurring motif in a song. He had known Sam in life, and in death the memory of her laugh and the tremor at the corner of her smile made the contents of that envelope something more than paper. He hesitated before breaking the seal because even as a detective he was a man who still kept sacred the edges of the dead, curiosity ward with reverence and duty. Inside, a laboratory form and a small printout. Sterile, clinical, the kind of thing designed to flatten human complexity into numbers and names. At the top, the date was years old, ink slightly faded. At the bottom, a single line read, "Biological father, Drew Kane." Dante read it twice, then a third time as if repetition could conjure context where none seemed to exist. There were signatures, stamps, a lab crest he knew well from years of cases. The certainty of the phrase hit like physical contact. It was not a rumor or a suspicion. The test, on paper, said what Sam had apparently known and kept to herself: Danny's blood did not match Jason's. The first wave of what followed was a cold clarity. Dante catalogued it the way he did the rest of his work. Who knew, when it might have been known, what motive could have guided someone to hide such a thing? Sam had always been fierce in the way that kept people safe. She had protected those she loved in the blunt, decisive manner of someone who knew how dangerous truth could be for fragile hearts. Had she hidden this to spare Jason? Had she, with the late-night pragmatism that had seen her through so much, decided that Danny's life with Jason was the better, safer option, and so kept the secret? The possibilities multiplied and each one landed like a pebble in a still pond, ripples of consequence stretching further than Dante wanted to imagine. He had to sit down against the metal drawer, the cold of it pressing through his trousers, and breathe until the world stopped spinning. Sam had died. That fact itself was a raw, impossible grief that still lived tenderly in Dante's chest. She had been his friend, someone who had stood beside him in moments that were a tangle of grief and stubborn joy. The idea that she had carried this enough to sign and seal it, to point a finger at a truth and then tuck it away, was a kind of betrayal because it was proof she had thought to protect someone from a truth they might otherwise deserve. Dante's professional instinct urged him to log the discovery, to mark chain of custody and alert a supervisor. His heart, though, locked him in place. To call the case open would mean hauling every person who had loved Sam into a storm. To leave it in that drawer was an act of concealment that went beyond protocol. What he felt then was the weight of impossible choices. The detective side of him argued for evidence, for transparency, for following a trail of facts wherever it led. The human side, the side that had watched Jason cradle Danny in a way that had nothing at all to do with DNA, that had seen how father and son had fit into each other's silences, urged him to protect that tenderness. Truth and mercy do not always share the same path. Dante found himself standing at a crossroads where law, loyalty, and compassion collided, and the intersection felt like a moral chasm. He studied the document the way he might examine a wound, looking for signs of tampering, anything that would suggest a mistake. The lab stamps were authentic. The signature matched a name he recognized. The date placed the test at a time when Jason had been presumed missing and when Drew's life had been a scattered jigsaw of fragments, when amnesia had made Drew a man caught between and outside himself. Memory and timeline smeared into one another. There was no obvious reason for Sam to falsify the paper, nor any reason for anyone else to have faked it. The implication pressed at Dante's chest. Sam had known, and on that knowledge she had acted with the private calculus that made soapstone choices for people whose lives were public theater. He did not place the file back without reading the annotations in the margins, the tiny handwriting that almost always betrayed a human story. There was a note, almost invisible, that said the sample had been solicited after an incident of fear, a parent who wanted verification. It read like a confession disguised as paperwork, the kind of childlike act of seeking certainty that Sam, quick-witted, wounded, principled in the most flawed ways, might have done quietly, without argument, because she wanted to protect the child she had carried. Dante imagined her in the sterile fluorescent light of a clinic, hands shaking just enough, mind racing with a litany of what-ifs. The picture in his head hurt him. Sam, after everything she had gone through, still trying to shield a small life from a truth she thought might do more harm than healing. From that arc of imagination grew 1,000 consequence scenarios. If Jason learned, the fallout would be seismic. Jason's identity, shaped by loss and the brutality of life, had found a steady anchor in Danny. To strip that away by fiat of fact would be to risk Jason's fragile equilibrium. Jason was a man who had been carved into pieces and then glued back together with small, stubborn acts of tenderness. The knowledge, if revealed in hurt, might unravel the new scenes life had bonded together. On the other hand, keeping it hidden felt like theft of right, theft of consent. Did Danny have a right to know his biological history? Did Jason have a right to the truth? Both answers landed like fists. Dante took the envelope home that night, a decision that felt corrupt and necessary in equal measure. He told himself he would treat it like any other piece of evidence, secure, not discussed, analyzed in the cold light of morning. The truth is, he wanted to keep it close in case he could make sense of the timeline and weigh his options without the immediate pressure of choosing between two beloved people. He told himself he would do the ethical thing. He had told himself that before he lied to protect someone he loved. The internal argument hummed beneath his skin like an old, familiar radio. For days, the paper lay in a drawer beneath a stack of bills and a photograph of his family that had nothing to do with the case. Dante moved through his shifts with a new kind of attention, noticing the way Jason moved through his kitchen when he visited, the way Danny flung himself into games with a kind of unstudied joy. He watched father and son in the way someone watches an eclipse, awe and impatience, a sense that the spectacle should be appreciated before it becomes gone. He watched Jason run a hand through Danny's hair with the tender impatience of the man who had known how fragile happiness could be. Jason's love was not a thing imposed by DNA but carved out by time, by sacrifice, by the daily mundane miracles of presence. It made Dante's decision to withhold the paper ache with moral contradiction. Secrets have gravity. They pull at the bones and make the sleeper shift in the night. Dante felt its pull. He began to see Sam in almost everything, the quickness of a joke, the curl of a smile, the way Danny rounded the corner of a sentence with the same leaning cadence as his mother. He tried to catalog what Sam must have known, the timing of the pregnancy, the periods when Jason wasn't there, the return of Drew with his broken memory. Sam had stood at the center of a storm that involved loyalty and love, and she had decided, with the terrifying autonomy that comes to those who keep others' safety in mind, that the truth might be less kind than the lie. In the meantime, Danny, young enough to be sensitive and old enough to notice things that don't fit, started to change. Children have sensors that adults lose. They feel shifts in the air around conversations, they watch the angles of faces, they listen for the small tones that betray something unsaid. For weeks Danny had been the same buoyant child who loved drawing planes and pressing his forehead against Jason's during long drives. Then he began to ask small questions that felt like pebble tosses part of a larger tide. Why did people sometimes whisper when they thought he was asleep? Why did Dante seem like he had something on his mind when he visited? Why did Drew suddenly start telling him stories about things Danny had not asked but listened to with a hungry, uncanny attention? Danny found the envelope because children find the places adults assume are secure. He was supposed to be waiting at Dante's while Jason ran into the precinct for just a sec, a phrase that in Port Charles had the elasticity of minutes that meant hours in other towns. Dante, half distracted and full of guilt, had left the envelope in an unlocked drawer to look at tonight. The house was messy with the banal debris of adult life, keys, mail, a half-drunk coffee, and a child finds gaps in that debris like a bird finds gaps in winter. Danny made himself small in the doorway and slid his hand in, thinking perhaps of secret treasure, and the paper slipped into his palms like a confessional. He did not know what he had. He only knew the word Drew when his eyes found it in bold type. Drew was a name he associated with Scout, with the late-night stories of a man who had been lost and found in pieces. The name meant other things too. It meant the man who had taught him to fish, who had tied his shoelaces with the patient fingers of someone who'd learned how to care for things that don't ask to be easy. Seeing the name in that context, biological father, Drew Kane, made something in him shift, like a toy that suddenly had a missing piece. He folded the paper along the crease Sam had once made and hid it in the sleeve of his coat as if he were protecting it from a world that had no right to such secrets. When Jason returned, he noticed Danny's silence. There was a tension in his jaw no number of consoling gestures could smooth away. Danny hugged himself as if to hold in the truth he barely understood. Jason's concern was immediate, practiced from a lifetime of caring for people who needed him. He tried to get him to talk, to coax the story out with promises of pizza and a later bedtime. Danny's face was an honest geography of worry and confusion. He wanted to ask but was afraid of what the question might do. Jason, who had learned to read small signs like weather maps, felt the weather turn. He ruffled Danny's hair and promised the sort of things fathers promise: the world will be fine, we'll fix it, you don't have to carry this alone. The promises felt, to Dante, both like balm and like a weight added to what he had hidden inside his drawer. Drew watched from the periphery of these small family scenes and felt an unfamiliar gravity to Danny's presence. There were moments when Danny leaned into him as naturally as a child might to a parent whose voice had always been kind. Drew, who had spent years piecing himself into a man he recognized, welcomed the closeness without the sense of entitlement. He had not known that a piece of him might belong to this child, and yet whatever biology might say, he felt a kinship that was neither asked for nor denied. When they spent a day at the river, with the sun low in the sky the soft blue of a painting, Drew found that the boy's small triumphs, catching a fish, tying a knot, lodged inside him as if they belonged. These little domestic victories carried more weight than any document could, and Drew marveled at the way this unexpected affection could seep into his chest like rain. Meanwhile, Dante's choice gnawed. He considered 1,000 ways to solve the moral equation. He thought about staging a retest in private, about confronting Drew, about slipping a copy of the report to Carly, who had hardened into a pragmatist willing to fight for what would spare Jason pain. For nights he wrestled with the ghost of Sam's intentions. What would she have wanted? Would she have wanted the truth to be a hammer or a bomb? He imagined Sam lying awake in some imagined room, rehearsing the confessions she did not get to make. He told himself he would honor her decision, but he did not know which of her decisions she would have chosen if she had stood on the cusp and had dared to weigh honesty against the tender fabric of a family. In private, Dante examined the report again and again. The lab's routing information suggested Sam herself had requested the test. The notes implied anxiety and fear, not malice. That, more than anything, stabbed him with regret. She had made a choice that might have been the most loving thing she could conceive: protect the boy from a reality that could unmoor him. But Dante also knew love could be complicatedly cruel. To deny Danny knowledge of his lineage for the sake of comfort was to practice a kind of paternalism that Sam, a woman who treasured autonomy even in its messy forms, might have abhorred. He found himself caught in a moral equation that had no right answer, only different degrees of hurt. The tension stretched and stretched until it became noise in the day, a low static that made him flinch at doors that opened too loud and look up when a laugh felt like a betrayal. He watched Jason with a tenderness he did not always show, and he began to understand what would be taken away if the paper's truth became public. There would be a fracture, a handing over of identity like a closed book forced open. But he also imagined Danny, older, finding out in a way that would make him ask whether the adults in his life had been honest with his heart. He saw a teenager scarred by a delayed revelation, eyes narrowing in disbelief and betrayal. How do you tell a child that the person who raised them was not their biological parent? How do you comfort someone who had built their life around a truth that was suddenly questioned? Days slipped into a rhythm of quiet observation and furtive avoidance. Dante started to watch his own hands when he gestured at dinner, as if he might be caught confessing his own trespass by the way his fingers moved. He sank into the peculiar isolation of someone who holds a secret that could rearrange people like a deck of cards. Every smile at the table felt like a potential rupture. Every bedtime story told by Jason carried the latent possibility of being wrong-footed by whole new biology.
That possibility made Dante wary of both action and inaction.
The narrative of the city's small household dramas tightened like a wire. Sam's envelope, tucked under the weight of Dante's conscience, was a sleeping thing that dreamed of waking. Danny, who had slipped the paper into his sleeve and felt the sting of knowledge he did not know how to name, did not yet have the vocabulary for betrayal. He had only the ache of being pulled in two directions he did not choose. The paper in his coat was a seed. It had roots that groped for both paternal hearts, for the man who had raised him and for the man who might have been his father. It would, in time, grow into a confrontation no one in Port Charles would be prepared for. For the moment, it waited under his small hand like a question that had no answer. That was where the first part of the story held. At the fragile hinge between what had been and what might be, with a detective holding a truth he could neither comfortably give nor morally keep, and with a boy who had found a secret and did not know what to do with it. The streets of Port Charles kept their watchful light, the rain easing to a steady sigh. Inside the houses and the briefcases and the soft rooms where grief still had a place at tables, people moved as if the world might hold. The envelope rested in a child's sleeve, the wetness of the night drying in the creases of paper and memory, and none of them knew that the next knock would be the one that opened everything up. Jason noticed the change in Danny before anyone else. It was in the way the boy lingered at the edges of rooms, how his laughter came slower, as if he were measuring the world before stepping into it. Jason tried to chalk it up to school, or maybe just the strange quiet that sometimes settled over kids after a growth spurt, but deep down, something told him this was different. Danny wasn't just distracted, he was carrying something. Jason's instincts, sharpened by years of navigating danger, told him the boy was guarding a truth. Drew saw it too, though what he noticed was subtler. There was a new light in Danny's eyes when they spoke, a curiosity that bordered on longing. The boy had started asking about fishing trips, about Drew's time overseas, even about the kind of breakfast Drew liked as a kid. At first, Drew thought it was just a child's natural fascination with stories. But as the days passed, he felt the undercurrent of something deeper, questions not yet spoken, threads of a connection that Danny was trying to weave quietly. Dante, caught between them, felt the walls closing in. Every interaction with Jason left him hollow. Every smile from Drew seemed to demand an explanation he couldn't give. He had been toying with the idea of a private conversation with Jason, telling himself that the truth, no matter how painful, would be better coming from him than from an accident. But then he would see Danny's face, caught between the comfort of his current life and the shadows of what could shatter it, and Dante froze. He had carried secrets before, but this one felt like a living thing that breathed at his shoulder. The moment of rupture came without warning. Jason and Drew had met at the Courtemain Gatehouse to discuss a scheduling issue with Scout, who would take her to an upcoming school trip, and the conversation quickly slid into tension. It wasn't about Scout at all. Old resentments, unspoken guilt, the awkwardness of two men who had been forced to share pieces of a life neither had chosen, all boiled beneath the surface. Voices rose. Jason's tone was clipped, Drew's jaw tight. It was in that rising heat that Danny walked in, small shoulders stiff, fists clenched. They didn't see him at first. Words like responsibility and commitment cut the air. Jason accused Drew of being unreliable when it mattered most. Drew countered with reminders of times Jason had chosen his work over family moments. The tension was a rope pulling taut between them, each tug sharper than the last. And then Danny's voice cut through it. "Stop it. Just stop." His shout was raw, trembling not with anger but with the kind of fear that comes from knowing too much. Both men froze, stunned by the tears pooling in his eyes. "You don't get to fight about me like I'm something you can trade." Because, his voice caught, and he swallowed hard before forcing it out. "Because Drew's my real dad." Silence swallowed the room. Jason's expression didn't change immediately, but there was a shift, something dark and unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Drew's breath caught, his brow furrowing as if the words themselves were too heavy to land all at once. Dante, standing in the doorway now, felt his heart sink into his stomach. The secret had escaped in the worst possible way. Jason's voice, when it came, was low. "Danny, what did you say?" The boy's chin trembled, but his eyes didn't waver. "I saw it. A paper. It said Drew Kane is my biological father." Each word landed with the finality of a gavel strike.
Jason glanced at Dante, the look sharp enough to cut.
"You knew," he said, not as a question but as an accusation.
Dante didn't deny it. His silence was answer enough.
The hours that followed were heavy with conversations no one wanted to have. Jason and Danny sat together in the living room, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the old mantel clock. Jason told him, in measured words, that no matter what any paper said, he was still his father in every way that mattered.
Danny listened, but there was a wall now.
A small, invisible barrier built from curiosity and the need to understand. Drew stayed in the kitchen, pacing, hands buried in his pockets. The possibility that he had missed all of Danny's life until now burned in his chest. He wanted to walk into the living room, to claim something that had been stolen from him without his consent, but the fear of taking something away from Jason kept him frozen. Later, when the house was quieter, Jason and Drew found themselves alone.
Neither man had the energy for yelling.
The sharpness from earlier had dulled into exhaustion. Jason's eyes were hard, but there was something else there too, a grief that Drew recognized because he felt it himself. "You should have told me," Jason said finally, his voice breaking just slightly. Drew met his gaze.
"I didn't know, Jason.
I swear.
But now that I do, I can't just walk away."
The words hung between them, the promise and the threat in equal measure. In the days that followed, Port Charles began to hum with the echoes of the revelation. Carly learned quickly Dante's guilt pushed him to tell her before she heard it from anyone else. She was furious, not only at Dante for keeping the secret but at Sam, gone now and unable to explain herself. Carly's protective instinct for Jason flared, but even she could see the storm gathering in Drew. Scout's name came up more than once. How would this affect her, knowing her brother and father's lives had been twisted by a truth that had slept for years?
Danny began splitting his time differently.
Some days he clung to Jason with a quiet desperation, as if afraid that too much time away would change something fundamental. Other days, he sought out Drew with a hunger for stories, for history, for the kind of shared moments he'd never had. The shifting balance between them was fragile, and everyone could feel it.
Jason tried to keep his focus on the boy's happiness, but there were moments.
Late at night, alone in the dark, when the thought hit him like a physical blow, that Sam had decided he didn't need to know, that she had given him a son that wasn't his by blood and let him believe otherwise. Drew's approach was cautious. He didn't want to replace Jason, but the instinct to be there for Danny was overwhelming. He began to imagine what their relationship could look like, a version where Danny had two fathers who loved him fiercely, where biology and history didn't have to cancel each other out. But he knew Jason's trust had been fractured, and rebuilding it would be a long road. Dante, meanwhile, found himself more isolated than ever. His choice to keep the secret had cost him Jason's trust entirely, and while Drew understood his hesitation, even that understanding was edged with disappointment. The knowledge that his inaction had led to Danny finding out on his own was a weight he couldn't shake. Every time he saw Jason now, there was an unspoken wall between them, built from betrayal and the impossibility of undoing what had been done. The next weeks in Port Charles would not be quiet. The truth had set something in motion, a slow, unstoppable shift in the lives of everyone involved. Jason would have to face whether he could forgive Sam, even in death, for keeping this from him. Drew would have to decide how far to push for his place in Danny's life without tearing the boy in two.
Carly, protective and calculating, would undoubtedly make moves to shield Jason from further hurt.
And Danny, caught between them all, would begin the slow process of understanding who he was, not just in the shadow of his mother's choices, but in the light of two fathers who both claimed him. No one in that small circle could predict exactly how the story would end, but one thing was certain. The quiet of Port Charles had been broken, and it would not return until every unspoken question between Jason, Drew, Danny, Dante, and Carly had been dragged into the light. And once the light found it, none of their lives would ever look the same again.